Welcome back for another adventure in math in which we're going to be adding fractions with unlike denominators. And here's where you're going to be applying what we've learned so far in equivalent fractions to your adding and subtracting fractions with unlike denominators. Just remember, whenever you see notes, you need to make sure that you write that down into your notebook. Anything in red in notes will tell you that that has to be in your notebook. You will have a couple pages where you won't have to write any notes, but you'll just be listening to me. So start off your notes with adding fractions with unlike denominators and write down your vocabulary of numerator, denominator, and LCD, which is new to you, the least common denominator. And that's going to be something that you're really going to need to focus in on. It's the lowest common number that both denominators can divide into, so it's the lowest number that both denominators share, so that way you can then add the fractions together. And we'll discuss that a little bit further. So looking at this problem of 3/8 plus 1/4, if we were going to add these two fractions together, you would need to follow these steps. And notice this is not a notes page, so do not write this into your notebook. You will be writing something like this later on. So first step would be finding the common denominator between 3/8 and 1/4. So noticing these denominators are not the same, so we have to find the common denominator, so that way they are the same. The second step is going to be rewriting the problem, so that way we now have brand new fractions to look at. And then the step 3 is adding the numerators. We're not adding the denominators at all. The denominators stay the same the entire time because the denominator represents the size of the piece. We're only adding the numerators. And then step 4 is we're going to simplify. Now simplifying is not going to be required by you guys for this year, but in the middle school and further on, you will be required to simplify your fractions. So it's good to start now in which you're going to be simplifying, but it won't be required. So it will be something optional that you can do, but you'll still be able to know how to do it. So if we were going to add 3/8 plus 1/4, why do we have to find the common denominator? Why can't we just add the numerators together? Well, if we see what 3/8 actually looks like as a fraction and what 1/4 actually looks like as a fraction, you can see that the pieces in 3/8 are much smaller than the pieces in fourths, because fourths are larger than eighths. And so if I wanted to take my fourth and add it to my eighths, as you can see, it would not fit in to the size of the eighths pieces. So I need to make them exactly the same size, so that way I can add them together. So the pieces must be the same size in order to be able to add them together. Well, how do we do that? And this is where equivalent fractions kicks in. So understanding your equivalent fractions and remembering from what we've learned about equivalent fractions, I'm going to look at eighths and fourths, and I'm going to notice that I actually have my lowest common denominator is actually eighths, because fourths can go into eighths. So that means I can make my 1/4 into eighths. So that would make my pieces exactly the same size. So that means I'm going to multiply 4 times 2 to get to 8. Well, if I'm going to multiply 4 times 2, then that means I have to multiply it by 2 over 2, because it has to be one whole. So my denominator is 2 and my numerator is 2. So if I multiply 1/4 times 2 over 2, I'm going to get a fraction of 2/8. And notice my pieces now change to the exact same size as the 3/8 pieces, because eighths are exactly the same size as each other. So now I have 2/8 and 3/8. And if you notice, the 2/8, as you can see, is exactly the same size as the 1/4 piece. And that's because they are equivalent fractions. So now I can actually rewrite my problem as 3/8 plus 2/8. And then if I add these two pieces together, because now that they're the same size, I can actually add them together. I would add my 2/8 over into my 3/8, and notice I get a total of 5/8. So that's why we have to make common denominators, because they have to be exactly the same size pieces, so that way we can fit them together. And like the analogy I gave you in class, is that they're like pieces of a puzzle. They have to be exactly the same size in order for you to put the pieces of the puzzle together. You can't put a floor puzzle with a jigsaw puzzle, because the pieces are completely different in sizes. You got to make them the same size to make sure that you can now put them together. And that's what I just did here. So understanding that, coming to step 1, now you're going to start taking these notes. As you can see, first step is find a common denominator. We're going to focus in on the LCD first. So A is all we're going to focus in on. B is for a little bit later on. All right, that's the second way of finding a common denominator. But the first way I want you to focus in on is the least common denominator. So for 3/8 plus 5/6, the least common denominator between these two numbers would be 24, because 6 does not go into 8, and 8 does not go into 6. And if we went up 1, 8 to 16, multiplying by 2, 6 does not multiply into 16. And so if we went up 3 times, 8 times 3 is 24, well, 6 times 4 is 24. So there's their least common denominator right there when I'm doing multiples. So in order to do the least common denominator, I would have to multiply 3/8 by 3 over 3, because 8 times 3 makes 24, and 3 times 3 makes 9. And so if I'm multiplying 3/8 by 3 over 3, I have to multiply 5/6 by something that's going to make that 24 as well. So here is not going to be the same thing. I'm going to now multiply my 5/6 by 4 over 4. And there's a reason, because 6 times 4 is 24. And so therefore, I have to then multiply 5 times 4. And so then you would rewrite that as this. And that's what you're going to actually do in the next step. So step 2, rewrite the problem. So from 3/8 plus 5/6 to now 9/24, because 3/8 times 3 over 3 is now 3 times 3 is 9, and 8 times 3 is 24. And then the same thing with 5/6. 5/6 would be 5 times 4 is 20, and 6 times 4 is 24. So we rewrite our equivalent fractions. Now, both of these fractions changed into equivalent fractions because both the denominators needed to change. And so therefore, I got 24 as my least common denominator. Well, after we rewrite, now we add the numerators. And so step 3 is add the numerators, in which 24ths and 24ths, same size pieces now. Now we just add 9 plus 20, and we get 29/24. So there's my answer, 29/24. Now technically you're done here. However, we expect you to go further with this a little bit more by simplifying, challenging the mind. So what would 29/24 be in a simplified version? Well, if you look at 29/24, we have more than 24. And so therefore we have more than a whole, because 24/24 is a whole. So what it would look like is this. It would be 24/24, and what's left over after the 24/24 is 5/24, because if you see 24 plus 5 makes 29. So therefore I have 24/24, which is one whole, and 5/24 left over, which is what gets added on to my one whole, which is the exact same way as saying 1 and 5/24. And this is what we call a mixed number, because it has a whole and a fraction with it. Now that is finding a common denominator, denominator with the least common denominator. This one is finding a common denominator by just multiplying the denominators in the fractions. So in this case, instead of trying to find the LCD, you're going to just multiply by the denominators, because they share that. So if I do 8 times 6, I'm going to get 48, and 6 times 8, I'm going to get 48. So therefore, I just multiply this fraction by 6 over 6, and I multiply this fraction by 8 over 8. So then I get bigger fractions. And this is the reason why we don't recommend you use multiplying by denominators, is because your fractions, the numbers in your fractions, the numerators and denominators, get to be huge numbers. And so now you're really adding very large numbers. And so now you need to really manipulate the numbers in a different way. So now I do 18 plus 40, and I get 58 over 48. Now, 29/24 is much easier to work with than 58 over 48. So that's why multiplying by the denominators is not such a good idea, but it works if you're having trouble with the LCD. Now, here's independent practice where you're going to put this into action. I want you to copy down 2/3 plus 1/6 and follow these steps of finding a common denominator, rewriting the problem, adding the numerators, and simplifying. And then the second problem is 4/9 plus 5/6. Both of these need to be completed in your notebook. Happy adding fractions.